Stadium naming rights are a big thing in professional sports. It wasn't always this way, of course. For generations, stadiums were named for teams or neighborhoods or owners or veterans. It was easy to remember their names. Places like Ebbets Field or Memorial Stadium, the Astrodome, Candlestick Park. But once the owners figured out that corporations would pay huge sums of money to have their names emblazoned on the side of their stadiums, everything changed seemingly overnight, which means we have Target Field in Minnesota, T-Mobile Park in Seattle, Petco Park in San Diego. Here in South Florida, the Marlins play at Lone Depot Park, which doesn't exactly roll off the tongue. My favorite was the short-lived Enron Field in Houston. After Enron tanked in the early 2000s, they quickly changed the name to Minute Maid Field, but I think it's something else now. I mention this not just to air a grievance from the pulpit or to announce that we are changing our name to Bethesda-by-the-Sea. But because name changes feature prominently in our readings this morning. In Acts, Saul, the great persecutor of the early church, was breathing threats and murder against the disciples of the Lord. We hear that. Then he has this dramatic conversion experience on the road to Damascus. And not only does his life change as he moves from chief persecutor to chief proclaimer of Jesus, so does his name. We don't read Saul's letter to the Philippians, for instance. We read Paul's letter to the Philippians. And we know that when Jesus first called Simon to drop his fishing nets and follow him, he renames him Peter and proclaims that upon this rock he will build his church. And so Saul becomes Paul, Simon becomes Peter. Their lives are transformed by their encounters with Jesus, and their name changes are outward and visible signs of this inner grace. So as we look at this final post-resurrection appearance at the very end of John's gospel, we can't help but hear echoes of earlier gospel stories. We look back to look forward into a future where Jesus is no longer physically present and yet abides with us still. But the first thing to acknowledge is that there is a lot going on in this gospel story. There's fishing and not catching anything. There's not recognizing Jesus at first, followed by that sudden moment of recognition. At one point, Peter takes off all of his clothes and jumps into the sea. There's the sudden abundance of fish and the oddly specific detail that they caught 153 fish. There's breakfast on the beach with Jesus, and finally, Jesus telling Peter 3 times to feed my sheep. So I want to start by pointing out some intentional parallels and imagery that harken back to some earlier moments in the lives of the disciples. The first point is that it all began with fishing and it all ends with fishing. Jesus called the first disciples by inviting them to drop their nets and follow him, and here they are again doing what was familiar as they tried to figure out a path forward without the physical presence of their Lord. You'll remember in one of the earlier fishing stories, Jesus tells them to put out their nets, even though the fish hadn't been biting. And suddenly they bring in such a haul that their nets begin to break. But in this story, the nets don't break. He had told them early on that they would no longer be fishermen, but fishers of men. But the disciples couldn't fully accept that, and so their nets broke. But now, on this side of the resurrection, they are ready to fully embrace their identity as apostles and evangelists who would carry Jesus' message of salvation to the world. And so the nets don't break. And you'll recall that in one of the earlier stories of Jesus out on the sea with the disciples, Jesus is in the boat with them. Remember that? He falls asleep, right? But the storm rages, and the disciples are terrified, and Jesus wakes up, well, they wake him up, and calms the storm. But here, Jesus is not in the boat with them. He's on the shore, which points to a new way of being his disciples now that his earthly ministry has ended. He's still present with them as he is with us, but in a new way. As long as they continue to heed his words and listen to his voice, they will know his presence. So while he's no longer in the boat with them, through the resurrection, not even death can separate them from Jesus. Now, there are many theories, most of them silly, as to the very specific number of 153 fish, but I think it's mostly about abundance. That was a ridiculous number of fish for a handful of friends to share for breakfast on the beach. But it also ties back to Jesus' first miracle at the wedding in Cana, where he turns water into an absurd amount of wine, more than a wedding party could possibly drink. And the feeding of the 5,000, where Jesus feeds a huge crowd with a couple of loaves of bread and a few fish, and there's even much more to spare. And we see that God's love and grace is more than we could even ask for or imagine. It overflows nets and stone jars and baskets. It simply cannot be contained. And that's the real point, the abundance of the 153 fish. Which takes us to the beach, and Jesus firing up the charcoal for a fish breakfast. Doesn't that sound just delicious? Now, I guess we could have had coffee hour on the beach this morning and grilled some fish. I'm sure the Hospitality Guild would have loved if I had suggested that. But this shared meal calls to mind the intimacy of the Last Supper. And of course, there are major Eucharistic overtones here. When we come to the altar here every Sunday to share Christ's body and blood, we are, spiritually speaking, heading to the beach for a meal with Jesus. And then we get back to that final encounter between Peter and Jesus. Simon, do you love me? Jesus asks him 3 times. And here's where the name change becomes important. Jesus reverts back to Peter's birth name. And so this episode functions as a story of recall. Jesus is once again calling Simon Peter. In the beginning, when he was physically present, he called him to follow him and learn from him. And now, after the crucifixion, after the resurrection, he is telling him to feed his sheep, to tend to the flock that is the early church, which also brings to mind Jesus as the Good Shepherd. To follow Jesus is to listen to his voice. And now, in Jesus' physical absence, Peter is being empowered to take on the role of the community's shepherd. And make no mistake, it's no accident that Jesus asks Peter 3 times whether he loves him. The same Peter who denied Jesus 3 times, is now asked 3 times whether he loves him. And you know what Jesus doesn't do? Shame him, or blame him, or condemn him for the denials. I'm sure Peter felt enough shame. Maybe that's even why he jumped naked into the sea once he recognized Jesus. But Jesus lovingly invites him to return to him and become the church's rock. And it's the same question Jesus asks us. Do you love me? Over and over again, he asks daily and throughout our lives, do you love me? And ours is to continually respond, yes, Lord, I love you. Not merely with our lips, but in the ways we order our lives, in the ways we interact with others, in the ways we serve Jesus. Eastertide is the perfect season to set aside some time to intentionally and authentically reflect upon the ways in which we answer this question Jesus poses to each one of us. Do you love me? In word and deed, let's show him just how much we do love him.